Over 2 billion people follow Jesus of Nazareth today. But from a purely historical perspective, proving the existence of a first-century peasant from a backwater Roman province requires specific physical and textual evidence. Among modern historians of antiquity, there is a broad consensus that a Jewish teacher named Jesus actually lived. Secular records provide a second independent line of evidence. Writing early in the 2nd century, the Roman senator Tacitus detailed the origins of the movement within his masterwork, the Annals. Tacitus records that the movement's founder, whom he calls Christus, suffered the extreme penalty of crucifixion under the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. This Roman record is corroborated by the 1st century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who also wrote of Jesus as a historical figure and noted his condemnation by Pilate. Even hostile texts, like the rabbinical writings of the Babylonian Talmud, acknowledge a figure named Yeshu and note his execution on the eve of Passover. Proving a man lived, gathered followers, and died on a Roman cross is straightforward history. Validating the miraculous claims found inside the New Testament is an entirely different methodological challenge. While external sources establish the footprint of his life and death, investigating an event like a resurrected body leaving an empty tomb required historians to use specialized tools to interrogate the biblical texts themselves. To separate historical facts from theological embellishments, New Testament scholars frequently rely on a heuristic known as the criterion of embarrassment. The premise is simple. When people invent stories to build credibility, they omit details that make them look foolish. Therefore, if a text contains material that would have embarrassed the early church, that material is likely an authentic historical report rather than a literary invention. Apologists point to one event as the ultimate test case for this criterion: the discovery of the empty tomb by female followers. The argument relies on a specific assumption about 1st century Mediterranean societies, including both Roman and Jewish legal frameworks. These cultures generally held women's speech in low esteem and rarely admitted it as authoritative testimony. Scholar Craig Keener examines the gospel through this cultural lens. He argues the witness of women at the tomb is likely historical because it was offensive to the larger culture, not the sort of testimony an author would invent. Because placing women at the center of the resurrection story would supposedly undermine the church's credibility in the ancient world, apologists conclude the authors must be reporting a stubborn, unchangeable historical fact. This heuristic serves as a primary pillar for validating the resurrection narrative. However, applying it requires historians to isolate the empty tomb scene entirely, ignoring the internal framework the author built to set it up. To see how the author structures this narrative, we have to examine the specific source document detailing these witnesses, the Gospel of Luke. If we want to test whether the tomb narrative is an embarrassing anomaly, we need to look at how the author sets up these characters early in the text. The critical setup occurs 16 chapters before the crucifixion, in Luke 8, verses 1 through 4. Here, the text lists the people traveling with Jesus. Alongside the 12 disciples, the author deliberately names 3 specific women: Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Susanna. The author provides a specific detail about Joanna. She is identified as the wife of Chuza, the manager of King Herod's household. She carries high political and social status. Notice the exact wording in verse 3. These women were helping to support them out of their own means. These are wealthy individuals, utilizing private resources to sustain the movement. The author introduces these women intentionally. They are presented as the economic engine of the ministry, powerful, resourceful patrons. There is no indication the author is embarrassed by their presence. We can trace this specific textual framing back to the earliest surviving material evidence, Papyrus 75. This document dates to the early 3rd century and is currently preserved inside the reading room of the Vatican Library. If we examine Leaf 15 verso, specifically line 26, we find a grammatical variant that clarifies the scope of these women's resources. Ancient manuscripts split into 2 distinct paths regarding a single Greek pronoun. Half use the plural, autois, meaning them, requiring immense wealth to fund everyone. The other half uses singular, auto, meaning him, preserving their status as his direct patrons. Regardless of which variant represents the original phrasing, the primary manuscript data confirms the text's intention. The Lucan author establishes these women as critical, well-resourced insiders with significant financial agency. The author's validation of women continues later in that exact same chapter, with the story of a woman suffering from severe bleeding. In the narrative, she reaches out and touches the edge of Jesus' cloak in a dense crowd and is healed. Jesus immediately stops, states that power has left him, and demands to know who touched him. The woman tries to remain unnoticed. Jesus refuses to allow this, forcing her actions out of private secrecy and into a highly visible public spectacle. The text is highly specific about how she delivers her account. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. Within the structure of the story, Jesus himself elevates a woman's voice, deliberately extracting and validating her public testimony in front of a crowd. By the end of chapter 8, the author has actively trained the reader. Female followers are financially crucial, explicitly validated by the central figure, and capable of reliable public testimony. This narrative structure leads straight to the climax of the text, the execution and burial described in Luke chapter 23. The author traces the exact same characters, Mary Magdalene and Joanna, from their introduction in Galilee directly to the execution site. The text carefully places these specific women as primary observers, watching how and where the body is laid. This continuous thread connects into chapter 24, where these established, trusted patronesses discover the empty tomb and deliver the message to the apostles. The logical flaw in the apologetic argument becomes obvious. Claiming the author included these women because he was forced to report an embarrassing anomaly directly contradicts the text itself. The author did not treat them as a cultural embarrassment to be hidden. He spent 16 chapters carefully building their financial status and their credibility as witnesses. In reality, the female witnesses at the tomb function as the intentional, meticulously engineered payoff of the author's narrative architecture. When the internal structure of the document is analyzed, the criterion of embarrassment fails completely as a useful test for this specific event. A growing consensus of critical historians recognize this problem, questioning the overarching logic of evaluating ancient texts using this kind of heuristic. In this critique, scholar Dale C. Allison Jr. points out that traditional sieves of authenticity appear to be fatally flawed. He argues historians must stop treating the Gospels as piles of raw data to be sifted for isolated authentic nuggets. Instead, these documents must be evaluated first as coherent literary presentations, designed by authors with distinct theological perspectives and narrative goals. To accurately understand the historical reality of the first century, we have to abandon convenient tests. We must engage with these ancient texts exactly as they were written, complex, deliberate. Look at the architecture of the modern world, and you'll find it rests on three main pillars: the scientific method, universal human rights, and the democratic instant spread of information. It is tempting to credit the ancient Greeks and Romans with building this foundation. They are, after all, heavily heralded as the grandfathers of Western civilization. But ancient Greek science was an exercise in pure philosophy, not physical experimentation. And the Roman operating system relied on an economy of mass slavery and violent public spectacle to maintain civil order. To locate the actual origins of our modern systems, historians have to look somewhere highly unexpected, to the lives and teachings of ancient religious figures, specifically Gautama Buddha and Jesus of Nazareth. Without tracing the exact historical shockwaves these two figures caused, we are left completely misunderstanding the machinery that runs our daily lives. There is a popular internet theory claiming figures like Jesus and Buddha were completely fabricated myths. But textual historians like Bart Ehrman point out that the earliest accounts of Jesus are full of what scholars call embarrassments. Details like Jesus coming from an insignificant town are the exact awkward facts mythmakers would simply scrub from a purely fictional narrative. We also find his existence independently recorded within decades of his death by major Roman and Jewish historians, including Tacitus and Josephus. The same historical rigor applies to the Buddha. In modern-day Nepal, archaeologists have uncovered the physical brick foundations of structures at Lumbini, geographically verifying the exact ancient site of his birth. By the 3rd century BCE, the Indian Emperor Ashoka had carved specific references to the Buddha into stone pillars across the continent, cementing a hard historical footprint. Because these were verifiable historical people rebelling against the rigid socio-political climates of ancient India and Roman-occupied Judea. Their specific teachings generated real, measurable ripples through human history. For a long time, the dominant narrative has been that religion and science are historical enemies. But medieval Christian theology held a specific doctrine called creation ex nihilo, meaning God created the universe out of nothing, giving the creator absolute freedom to set the physical rules. If the universe's rules were freely chosen, rather than logically necessary, scholars realized they couldn't deduce physics using pure logic, as the Greeks did. To figure out how the universe worked, they had to observe it. This specific theological mandate forced early scholars like John Philoponus to reject purely philosophical physics and start conducting actual physical experiments, like dropping different weights to see how fast they fell. By the 14th century, Parisian scholar John Buridan took this empirical approach even further, conceptualizing relative motion and outlining the conservation of momentum. Without intending to, medieval theology had accidentally built the exact metaphysical scaffolding required for the later scientific revolutions of Newton and Galileo. At the same time, the ethical instructions left by these historical figures provided a systematic approach to human conduct. The Buddha taught ahimsa, strict nonviolence toward living beings, while Jesus instructed his followers in a radical form of universal compassion. Over the centuries, these teachings motivated the founding of the world's first hospitals for the poor and drove Christian politicians like William Wilberforce to systematically dismantle the global slave trade. But for these reformist ideas to transform society on a massive scale, they had to bypass the strict control of religious and political authorities. The Protestant Reformation provided the exact spark needed, aiming to translate the Bible out of Latin so everyday people could interpret the text for themselves. To do that, they weaponized Johannes Gutenberg's movable type printing press. This invention took a theological rebellion and turned it into the world's first mass media revolution, shattering the institutional monopoly on knowledge. Eventually, these religious concepts of universal human dignity scaled up, shedding their theological origins to become the secular international laws governing our modern geopolitical landscape. Modern human rights and democratic information networks are not sudden inventions of the 20th century. They are the direct, scaled-out outcomes of ancient theological frameworks. The physical laws driving space exploration, the tribunals defending human rights, and the decentralized networks carrying our information are all direct descendants of religious frameworks. You do not need to be a theologian or hold personal religious beliefs to observe this objective historical progression. To truly understand the secular pillars of the modern world, we have to recognize that they were poured using the philosophical concrete of ancient historical figures.